The room has no windows. That's the first thing you notice. No clocks either. Just 12 people seated around a table made from wood so old it looks like it remembers something. And every single one of them is silent. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say. The silence of people who have been waiting a very long time to say something. And now that the moment has arrived, they don't know how to begin. Because the question on the table tonight isn't strategic. It isn't political. It isn't even theological in the traditional sense. The question someone finally whispered before the session opened was this: who armored that soul? And that question, those 4 words, cracked something open in the room. Because everyone there had encountered the same person, same individual, someone who had been through the kind of suffering that should have broken a human being into powder. Someone who had no support system that anyone could see, no mentors who claimed them, no institutions that built them, no obvious moment of transformation they could point to. And yet this person stood, not barely, not trembling with 1 foot off the edge. They stood like a wall, like something forged in fire so hot that the fire itself stepped back. And these 12 people, who spend their lives studying the architecture of the human soul, had gathered in emergency because none of them had an answer. They needed one. Because if something or someone is armoring people like that, then the world is far more extraordinary than even they believed. Stay with me. If this message is already doing something in your chest, subscribe to this channel right now, because we go deep here, we go real, and there are people who need what God is going to speak through this conversation. Drop the word armored in the comments right now. Let that be your declaration. Let it be your prayer. Let it be your signal to heaven that you are ready to understand what has been protecting you all along. Because here is what I need you to know before we even begin. You might be the person in that story. You might be the one they were discussing. And if so, this message is not an accident. Nothing about the next 20 minutes of your life is random. There is a phenomenon that psychologists have a clinical word for, but the clinical word doesn't capture it. The word they use is resilience. But resilience, as most people understand it, sounds like a rubber band, something that stretches and then bounces back. What these 12 people were describing was not a rubber band. It was something more like bedrock, something that doesn't bounce back because it never bent to begin with. And that distinction matters enormously, because if we misdiagnose the source of someone's strength, we also misunderstand the nature of the war they've been surviving. There is a verse in the book of Job that most people skip over because the surrounding chapters are so overwhelming. But in Job chapter 1, verse 10, Satan himself says something that reveals more about divine strategy than most sermons ever will. He says to God, speaking about Job, "Have you not put a hedge around him, around his household, and around all that he has on every side?" That is the adversary, complaining, not about what Job has, complaining about what is around Job. Because what surrounds a chosen person is not comfort, it is not ease, it is not a life without pain. It is a hedge, an invisible, structured, intentional protection that operates even when the person inside it has no idea it exists. Now ask yourself something honest. How many times have you walked through something that, statistically, should have destroyed you? Not metaphorically, literally. Things that took other people out completely. And you're sitting here, watching this, still breathing, still searching, still reaching for something you can't fully name. That is not coincidence. That is not toughness. That is not self-help working. That is the hedge. The summit isn't asking why some people survive. They're asking who built the hedge. Because a hedge like that doesn't build itself. And it doesn't come from human architects. The 12 people in that room had studied suffering for decades. They had mapped trauma. They had documented the psychological mechanisms of survival. And they were sitting in a windowless room in emergency session, Because none of their maps covered this territory. Because what they encountered wasn't in any textbook. It was in the oldest book. Here's what the summit eventually had to confront. And this is where the conversation became dangerous, in the best possible sense of that word. They had to confront the fact that the armor they were studying didn't appear after the trials. It appeared before them. This is critical. So critical that I need you to set down whatever you're doing and actually feel this. The person they were examining hadn't developed strength through suffering, which is the normal model. The normal model says, fire enters, fire exits, person emerges stronger. That is the traditional arc. That is what we celebrate in culture. The comeback story. The underdog who rises. But this was different. This person entered the fire with the armor already on. Which means the preparation preceded the persecution. The shielding came before the storm. And in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 1, verse 5, God says something that most people read as sweet and poetic, but is actually an operational declaration. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. The Hebrew word there for set apart is kadash. It means to consecrate, to make holy, to designate for a specific and sacred purpose. It is not passive, it is active. God didn't discover Jeremiah's potential after Jeremiah showed up. God made a deliberate, intentional, pre-birth assignment, and that assignment came with what every assignment requires: equipping. The armor isn't something you earn through performance. The armor is part of the assignment. And the reason the summit was shaken is because if the armor comes with the calling, then some people have been walking around armored without knowing it, confused about why they don't break the same way others break, wondering if something is wrong with them, wondering why they feel different, wondering why the things that destroy other people leave them changed but not finished. And if that is you, this is the moment you stop calling that difference a defect. That difference is a design. The summit had a historian in the room, an older woman who had spent 40 years documenting what she called the literature of the indestructible. Stories throughout history, across cultures, across centuries, of individuals who had no external reason to survive what they survived, and yet did. And she said something that ended every other conversation in the room. She said, "In every case I documented, without a single exception, the person was either completely unknown before the trial, or they were deeply misunderstood by the people closest to them. The isolation wasn't incidental to their story. The isolation was the preparation ground." The room went silent again. And that silence is the silence I want to create right here, in this moment, with you. Because I need you to hear this next statement with every cell in your body. If you have felt alone, if you have felt like the people around you couldn't fully reach you, couldn't fully understand you, couldn't quite see what you were carrying or why you carried it the way you did. If you have sat in rooms full of people and still felt like a stranger looking in from the outside. That is not a wound, that has been a workshop. The isolation that has confused and sometimes devastated you has been functioning as a controlled environment, where God has been building something in you that cannot be built in crowds. It cannot be built in the applause of people who affirm you. It cannot be built where distractions are plentiful and where comfort is available on demand. The specific kind of armor that the summit was trying to name can only be forged in the furnace of felt invisibility. Because in that furnace, the only thing available to hold on to is God Himself. And when God is the only thing you have, God becomes the only thing that shaped you. And a soul shaped entirely by God is a soul that the enemy cannot decode, cannot replicate, cannot predict, and cannot ultimately defeat. Let's talk about something that the summit found in the psychological data that nobody wanted to say out loud at first, because it was uncomfortable. What they found was that the people they were studying, the armored ones, shared a specific emotional signature in childhood and early life. It wasn't confidence. It wasn't obvious giftedness. It wasn't the markers you'd expect. The signature was grief. Early, unexplained, sometimes unnamed grief. A feeling that the world wasn't quite right. A sensitivity so acute that beauty could bring them to tears just as fast as pain. A hunger that nothing available could satisfy. An awareness of a dimension of reality that others around them seemed completely unbothered by. And the historian opened her folder and laid a passage on the table. It was from the book of Psalms, Psalm 22, verse 9 and 10. Yet you brought me out of the womb, you made me trust in you, even at my mother's breast. From birth I was cast on you. From my mother's womb, you have been my God. The summit studied that passage for a long time, because what David is describing is not simply trust. He is describing an original bonding, an attachment formed not to a parent, not to a community, not to a system, but to God Himself, from the very first breath. And here is the psychological implication of that, and it is staggering. When a human being's deepest attachment is to something eternal, they will always feel partially alien in a world built on temporary things. The grief isn't pathology. The grief is homesickness. The sensitivity isn't weakness. The sensitivity is the nervous system of someone built for a different frequency. And the hunger, that relentless, unsatisfied, beautiful hunger that nothing in this world quite fills, that is not emptiness. That is the shape of God's own fingerprints pressed into the lining of your soul before you arrived. Now the summit had to wrestle with a theological problem that most churches don't have the courage to address publicly. If God armors souls before the battle, and if the battle still comes, and comes hard, then what exactly is the armor doing? Because the chosen people they were studying weren't exempt from pain. They were not protected from loss. They were not shielded from betrayal, from failure, from the specific cruelties that life deposits on the doorstep of the earnest. So what is the armor? If it doesn't prevent the wound, what does it do? And the answer they arrived at, after hours of circling the question, was this. The armor doesn't block the arrow, it determines where the arrow lands. There is a profound moment in the book of Daniel. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown into a furnace so hot that the soldiers who threw them in died from the heat at the door. And inside the fire, something extraordinary happens. They walk. They are not consumed. And when the king looks in and sees them walking, he sees 4 figures, not 3. And the 4th, he says, looks like a son of the gods. That 4th presence is the key. They weren't protected from the furnace. They were accompanied through it. And the accompaniment was so powerful, so utterly present, that the fire that was designed to destroy them lost its primary weapon. It could burn, but it couldn't bind. When they came out, the text says their clothes didn't smell like smoke. The fire burned the ropes, but couldn't touch the men. The armor isn't a shield that keeps you out of fire. The armor is a presence so total inside you that when fire comes, it burns everything peripheral and leaves the essential untouched. What you lose in the fire was never your armor. What you lose was what the fire was always meant to remove. This is the part of the summit that became the turning point. And it became the turning point because one of the 12 people around that table did something no one expected. He stopped theorizing. He stopped referencing data. He put his hands flat on the old wood table and he said quietly, "I think we've been asking the wrong question." The room looked at him, and he said, "We've been asking who armored this soul, as if armor is something administered from a distance, as if God is a manufacturer and we are products. But what if armoring isn't something done to a person? What if armoring is something that happens in the space between a person's cry and God's response?" And then he referenced a moment that everyone in the room knew, the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus, on the night before the cross, in a garden, with sweat falling like blood, praying the most honest prayer ever recorded. Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will. That prayer is not the prayer of someone who didn't want the armor. That prayer is the prayer of someone choosing to receive it. The cup didn't pass, the cross came. But between the prayer and the cross, an angel appeared and strengthened him. Not removed the trial, strengthened him for it. The armor, this man at the table said, is the accumulated strength deposited into a soul every single time that soul chose trust over terror in the dark. Every time you prayed something honest and terrifying and stayed. Every time you had the chance to run and didn't. Every time the silence of God felt like abandonment and you reached anyway. Those moments weren't just survived, they were constructive. They were adding something to your interior, layer by layer, weight-bearing and invisible. You were being armored by your own faithfulness in the furnace, and God was meeting that faithfulness with His. And together, those two things became something that the enemy had never calculated and cannot now dismantle. Let's bring this into the territory of your actual life, because the most powerful truths are the ones that don't stay abstract. They come down into the everyday, into the Monday morning, into the argument you didn't win, into the relationship that ended without resolution, into the job you lost, into the diagnosis you received alone in a car and sat with for 40 minutes before going back inside. Here is what the summit ultimately concluded about the practical reality of armored souls. They said that armored people carry an interior that is not dependent on the exterior. And that is extraordinary, because the entire world is designed to make your interior follow your exterior. Everything in modern culture is calibrated to make you feel good when things are good and destroyed when things fall apart. The entire economy of emotional health in this culture is managed externally. You are supposed to feel strong when you have community, when you have success, when you have clarity about your future. And you are supposed to feel weak, or at minimum tender, when you have none of those things. But the armored soul inverts this. The armored soul can be surrounded by wreckage on the outside and still carry something ordered on the inside. Not because they are in denial, not because they are suppressing, but because the source of their interior order is not in the exterior world at all. It is in a relationship with a God who does not fluctuate based on circumstances. And this is the practical spiritual lesson that the summit encoded in everything they would do next. If you want to understand the armor, you have to understand the intimacy. The depth of the armor is exactly proportional to the depth of the relationship. The question was never whether God could armor you. The question is how close you've been willing to get to the one who does the armoring. And closeness is not achieved by having the right theology. Closeness is achieved by honest, sustained, sometimes painful, utterly authentic conversation with God that refuses to stop even when the conversation seems to return silence. There is a kind of person who will watch this message and feel two things simultaneously. They will feel seen and they will feel terrified. Seen because something in this message has been speaking the language of their interior life in a way that very few voices have managed. Terrified because if all of this is true, if they have been armored for a purpose, if the isolation was a workshop and the grief was homesickness and the hunger was God's fingerprints, then they have a responsibility that they cannot unknow. And that responsibility is enormous. Because purpose without activation is just potential sitting in a room with no windows. And this is the moment the summit ended. Not with answers, but with a commissioning. Because the 12 people who walked out of that room did not leave knowing all they wanted to know. They left knowing what they were required to do. They were required to go and find the armored ones, to tell them, to name what had been unnamed, to reach into the community of the quietly extraordinary and say, "You are not broken, you are not behind, you are not overlooked, you are in active preparation." And the preparation is almost complete. In the book of Esther, Mordecai says to the queen, who has been living in a palace, comfortable, hidden, reluctant to step into her calling, "Who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" That question is not rhetorical. It is directional. It is a spiritual GPS pointing at destiny. And right now, in this moment, through this screen, through this message, through this exact frame of your exact life, that question is being asked of you. Not of someone more impressive, not of someone with better credentials, not of someone who hasn't made mistakes or carried wounds or sometimes wondered if God had the right address. You, specifically. Who knows whether you have not been armored for exactly this time? The answer is, the one who armored you. And he knows. You made it to the end. And I want you to understand something about that. In a world designed to distract, in a culture engineered to scatter your attention across 1,000 surfaces, you stayed. And staying, as we have established today, is itself an act of armor building. It is a small but real decision that deposits something into your interior. I want to close by giving you the full picture of what we uncovered together. In that windowless room, around a table that remembered something older than its own existence, 12 people gathered to ask who armored a soul. And what they found was this. The armoring is not a transaction. It is not a reward for perfect performance. It is not withheld from those who stumbled or given exclusively to those with prestigious callings. The armoring is a covenant act. It is the overflow of a relationship between a God who is love in its purest form and a soul that chose, however imperfectly and however afraid, to keep reaching for him. The armor is built in the dark. It is constructed in the honest prayers nobody else heard. It is layered in the moments of obedience that cost something real. It is reinforced every time you turn back toward God when turning away would have been easier. And it is yours. Not because you deserve it more than anyone else, but because you were made for something that requires it. If this message found you today, carry it, not as information, as permission. Permission to stop apologizing for your depth. Permission to stop minimizing what you've survived. Permission to stop waiting for someone outside of you to confirm what God has already spoken over you in the secret places. You are not ordinary. You were not accidentally complex. You were not mistakenly sensitive. You were not randomly resilient. You were armored. Before the war, for the war, through the war. And the war is not over, but neither are you. Subscribe to this channel right now. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and leave armored in the comments if this message moved something in you. Because you are chosen, and now you know. And knowing changes everything.